Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In a recent video, I did a how will foil video where I tested 14 different papers that I have in my art room just to see how they would foil. And two of those papers were watercolor. So I had a white Strathmore watercolor paper, and then I also had a black Stonehenge watercolor paper. So if you've seen that video, this particular part is a repeat of that. This is just how I foiled those papers. Just the traditional way. I put it on my glimmer machine with my foil facing the plate, the pretty side facing the plate, and foiled the papers. Now they foiled fairly well. They're not absolutely perfect. There was some over foiling, and I had to take a stiff brush and just brush some of that off. So in this video, I thought I would take those two papers and watercolor them. Now, because we've got one that's got a light background and one that's got a dark background, you can't necessarily watercolor them with the same mediums. So I'm going to show you how I treat the different background surfaces when I'm watercoloring. One of my favorite ways to watercolor is using distress reinkers. Now these are typically meant for refilling distress ink pads. They come in little droppers like the one that you see here, and I just put them on a palette. I leave them in that palette. They never dry, but they've got some beautiful color. You can get some really concentrated color, and you can also mix it with water and get a nice light version of that color. Because the ink is so concentrated to begin with, and then you can water it and get lighter versions of the color, there's just so many different color variation possibilities, and it's beautiful and transparent, and it's just one of my favorite ways to watercolor. So you see me here, I'm watercoloring the peony with Spun Sugar, and then I'm going in with some picked raspberry. It's one of my favorite pinks. It's a nice hot pink, but I'm making some of the bases of the petals a little bit darker and just getting some variation between the lights and the darks on the flower petals. Now I will list and link all the supplies that I've used for this in the description box below. So if there's anything that I happen to forget to mention, you'll find that information down there. I like using a water brush that has water right in the handle. So you'll see me, I have a paper towel to the side, and I will regularly either get excess water off my brush that way or excess color. If I'm mixing between or going back from the pink to the green for the leaves, I will squeeze the brush out onto that paper towel, and that completely cleans my brush out. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz, so if I had a bottle of water or a glass jar with water on my desk, there's a very big likelihood that I would knock it over and make a huge mess. So this particular tool is absolutely perfect for me. I've had mine for many, many, many years, and I absolutely love it. One year when one of my daughters was in high school, she borrowed my brush because she was playing around with watercolor, and I was so worried about not getting it back. I actually bought myself a backup so that I wouldn't worry about it because I wanted to encourage her creativity, but I also didn't want to lose my tool. So I actually have two of these. I did get my original one back, but I loved it so much that I bought a second one. So it is one of my most used tools in my craft room. And I highly recommend, if you don't already have one, if you like to try watercolor or like to play around with watercolor, it's something that I don't think you'll regret. So I've gone from the flowers to working on the stems and the leaves now, and I'm using peeled paint distress refill for this. And even though I chose to only use one particular color for this, you can see that I do get some lights and darks. I tend to start where I want my color to be the darkest, so that would be the stems and then the bases of the leaves. I'll wipe the excess ink off of my brush, and then I'll go in with just a clean brush and just brush out some of the color. You do want to make sure that you do this while that ink is still wet. If you let it dry, you're going to get some marks and ridges and stuff like that. So you do want to move quickly and do that while it's wet. If you find that when you brush out the excess color, you lose some of the lights and darks, you can go back in with that dark color and just dot it in the areas that you want it to be the darkest. And because it is liquid and still wet, it should blend together. Now I'm going to my dark base. Now this first one here, I'm just showing you. I can't use these distress reinkers for watercoloring it because they're transparent. You can see the color on top of the foil, but you can't actually see the color on the black watercolor paper. So there's a couple options here. The first option would be to use these distress watercolor pencils. These are a new thing that just came out within the last year. They do have some opacity to it, but you can tell that I'm not going to get a nice solid image on top of a black background here. So if you're wanting a subtle effect on a dark background, this is a good choice. Now I can wait till it's dry and then go back in and just kind of layer those colors, but I'm still going to be seeing an awful lot of black through that color. Does have some opacity to it, but it's not totally opaque, so it's not going to cover that black at all. But I just wanted to put this in here just to show you that this is an option if this is a look that you are trying to go for. And then I do the green of the petal just so that you can see the green as well. But what I want to use for this particular card base is my Perfect Pearls. Now, Perfect Pearls are a mica powder that have a binding agent in them that is activated by water. So it's perfect for watercoloring. The other thing that is great with Perfect Pearls is if you have a lot of mica and a little bit of powder, you're going to get a more opaque paint. Whereas if you add more water, your paint is going to be more transparent. So you have control over how see-through or how opaque it is. Now, it comes in a bunch of different colors and they're absolutely beautiful. Your painted image is going to end up having a metallic finish because it is a mica powder, but it's a great way to do some watercolor over top of a dark background because that mica has some opacity to it, and you will see a little bit of the black through it if you choose to make your paint a little bit more transparent, but you have that control. So it's a great way to use the supply app, and it's something that I use often with different areas of my craft room. There's so many different things that you can do with mica powders, but this is just one of them. I love using them for watercoloring. You can see I'm mixing my paint in just the lids from the Perfect Pearls. If you do this, you want to set them aside and let them dry completely before you close your lids. You don't want to close them while you've got that bit still wet there, because otherwise you're going to possibly have it drop into your Perfect Pearls and have a solid part of your Perfect Pearls. So just something to be aware of. Make sure that you let it dry completely first before you put it away. You could also use this in a palette like I used with my Distress ink refills. It'll absolutely work that way. Or you can reuse like a plastic lid from a sour cream container or something like that, something that you would normally throw away, and use that as a palette. That would absolutely work as well. So you've got a lot of options when you're doing this. Doing it this way, working in the lid, it just keeps it a little bit more contained. But like I said, it does take a little while for this to dry on the lid, so you want to make sure that you have that time and the space to be able to do that, and to be able to put it somewhere where you're not going to accidentally knock over your Perfect Pearls. So as you can see, as I'm going here, I've got some areas that are more opaque and some areas that are more transparent. That is because that's how I chose to do it. I wanted to make sure that you saw a little bit of the black through there. I didn't want to completely lose the black, but you absolutely could if you wanted to. The other option that you could choose to do this would be to have metallic watercolors and use those on here. And these are essentially metallic watercolors with the mica, but this way you have the control. Another thing, you could probably use gouache. And to be honest, it's not something that I have or have used, but I know it's a nice thick paint that probably has some opacity to it. So if you happen to have it in your stash, it's something that you might want to try on dark cardstock. So the one thing that I haven't done yet for these flowers is put the centers of the peonies, and I wanted to let them dry a little bit because I didn't want the yellow to completely run into the pinks of my flowers. So for my white colored base, I just used some scattered straw. For the dark colored base, I used some gold Perfect Pearls, and then I chose to go into my light colored one with the gold Perfect Pearls as well, just to add a little bit of shimmer to it. So I set those aside to dry and then trimmed them down to go on my card fronts. I've already picked my bases. I have a container that I have a whole bunch of card bases already made, as well as another container where I just have cut all of my scraps into different sizes for mats and stuff like that, just to kind of clean out my scrap cardstock bin, as well as having things ready to go, ready to just grab and put things together. It comes in quite handy rather than having to go through the scrap bins all the time. Now I have my sentiments here. They were previously foiled and I have them just in a container ready to go, and they have the same color foil as the image parts to the cards. So I'm just gluing everything down flat. If you want anything to have dimension to it, you can either add extra die cuts behind it, or you could also use foam pop dots. For this, I didn't really think it needed a lot of extra dimension, so I chose not to add it to it. I'm using some distressed collage medium to glue my pieces together, and I love using this glue because liquid glue gives you the freedom to be able to shimmy things in place if you don't put it down totally perfectly the first time. And the other thing is Distress Collage medium dries completely clear, and it also dries matte. So if anything happens to seep out, you're actually not going to see it, which is a nice bonus, I think. You'll also notice that while I'm putting glue on pieces, I'll put an acrylic block on the part that I glued down before just to hold it down. That saves me time and frees up my hands to do other things rather than holding things down. So now that I've got everything glued, I'm just going to let it completely dry, and here is the final result. I'm really, really pleased with how the watercolor paper foiled, and I think it's a beautiful outline for these images, for these cards. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you have a fabulous day.